Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, August 7th, 2025. I am John Bothoritz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist and director of domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And Matt's colleague at AEI, our social commentary columnist, Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
So the big news this morning out of nowhere is that after Steve Witkoff went to Moscow to talk to the Russians, Trump and Putin are having some kind of a summit at some point in the next some kind of days. And I guess we're not officially going to call it a summit. They're going to meet. Summits are very elaborate affairs with breakout groups of officials at all levels of government talking about, the classic summit, commerce, culture, cultural exchanges, military matters, all of that. Both, the State Department, the Defense Department, their people all get together and issue communiques or have meetings or all of that. This seems to be just head to head, Trump and Putin, in a room, oiled up, chairs, going to throw chairs at each other, no referee, ultimate fighting. Two things about this. One is that it comes at the time that that the tariffs are now the presidentially ordered tariffs are now going into effect, and they have a particular effect on Russia, because not only do we have a tariff on Russia, but there are tariffs on Russian goods that go to other countries, particularly India, that are going to be incredibly punitive toward the Russians, and Trump has that in his pocket as he goes to talk to Putin about changing his course in the, sort of the warfare with Ukraine. So the one good thing I could think of to say about the tariffs is that maybe they can be used as a weapon to bring Putin to heel. We're going to talk about the tariffs a little later, Matt.
Right. Was there a second thing that you wanted to say about the Ukraine, Russia? You said there were two things.
Okay, so that I sort of
you combined the two.
Because the other is this move that Trump has made basically to come in as, unless things change at this summit and they have a love fest, to come in and essentially serve as Ukraine's negotiator.
This is why this summit news is a little bit confusing to me. I just want to take a step back and go over some of the recent events. Trump, gave initially a 50-day deadline to Russia to reach a ceasefire or to face punishing tariffs and additional sanctions, perhaps even the bipartisan bill in the Senate that would have crippling secondary sanctions on countries that purchase Russian oil. That's Russia's main export, is oil and gas. Last week, Trump shortened the deadline to 10 days. And the deadline comes up tomorrow. We're recording this on August 7th. The deadline is August 8th. And so Putin, of course, has shown no sign that he wants to reach a ceasefire. And so there is this deadline that Trump has established, which is tomorrow, for a ceasefire or consequences. In the midst of that, we had Witkoff travel first to the Middle East, where he visited Gaza with Ambassador Mike Huckabee and met with Israeli officials regarding the food situation in the Gaza Strip and perhaps next moves on the ground as well. And then we were surprised when we learned that he was tacking on a trip to Moscow. First, it was unclear whether he would meet with Putin at all. It did turn out that he met with Putin yesterday. The meeting was about 3 hours. That's typical for a Witkoff-Putin meeting. Putin does most of the talking, I think. And the Russian government released a statement saying that it was a productive meeting, and that was the same statement Trump issued on Truth Social. What does this mean? Well, it means that we had this news that Trump and Putin intend to meet at some point in the future. Russia says that could happen as soon as next week, that they're looking at a location. I remain slightly skeptical. We'll have to see. We also have to see what Trump does tomorrow. Again, the whole taco complex, the idea that Trump always chickens out, does haunt the administration. And so if he just ignores the deadline he set and doesn't impose any consequences for Putin's total disregard for Trump's demands and gives Putin a meeting, I think that there's no way to spin that as other than advantage Putin, advantage Russia. So just one more comment on India. Even though this diplomatic track is happening, I do think it's wrong to say that Trump is one-sided toward Russia in this conflict. We had a very successful NATO meeting earlier in the summer where NATO was full force behind the 5% GDP for defense commitment. We'll see how that plays out, of course. Trump was effusively pro-NATO, talking about how these nations just want to defend their countries. I think, as I've mentioned before on the podcast, Trump has been persuaded to some extent by the Europeans and probably by his own intelligence services, other than our director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, that Putin plans to expand the war if he's successful in Ukraine, maybe after a year or so, but he does intend to eventually challenge NATO itself. And as a result of that, Trump not only issued the deadline I just mentioned, but he also came up with this deal whereby NATO would purchase weapons from the United States and then hand them to the Ukrainians. That's happening. We are providing military aid to the Ukrainians in addition to the military aid that's already been appropriated, right? And so that's continuing. The additional NATO thing is continuing. And then we have this secondary tariff, essentially, on India. India is a huge purchaser of Russian energy. India also buys weapons from Russia. And Trump has now elevated the tariff on India to quite a high extent in order to get them to separate from Russia. I think this is a good thing. It is damaging to U.S.-Indian relations, which are in a free fall right now. But I do think it's a good thing. My additional comment would be, where is China in all this? And I'll just finish with this. A lot of Trump people, a lot of MAGA people say, well, Donald Trump, he's going to pull a reverse Nixon. He's going to improve our relationship with Putin and pull Putin away from China, just like Nixon recognized China in 1972 with his visit there and pulled China away from the Soviet Union. I've always thought that was a flawed analogy for many reasons. One, the Soviets and Mao Zedong's China were on the brink of nuclear war when Nixon came in and was able to create the relationship with China. But I also think it gets it wrong. I think if there's any possibility, it's that Trump tries to push China away from Russia and tries to get a better deal with China in order to get China, Xi Jinping, to somehow say to Putin, time to wrap up the war. And that may explain why, while Trump is imposing these secondary tariffs on India, he is not talking China right now. My lecture has ended.
Very interesting analysis. I think something changed in Trump's spirit. You know, people are always talking about looking into Putin's heart. You know, George W. Bush said he looked into Putin's heart. And Hillary Clinton in 2009 said she thought that there was the possibility of a reset because we see these things about Putin that nobody else necessarily sees. And I wonder whether something happened with Trump where he saw Putin's heart, but in the reverse way. He is not the same person toward Putin that he was in January. It's just the fact of the matter that he may never quite have grasped just how serious Putin was about swallowing Ukraine up, and that we don't know what intelligence the president sees. We don't know what they know. We don't know how deeply they've penetrated the Russian government. Clearly, very deeply, because we had extremely good intelligence on the run up to the invasion of Ukraine, clearly in 2022. So we have reason to believe that we know a lot of what is being said in the councils of power that Trump wasn't privy to because he wasn't president and they were trying to throw him in jail and everything. And I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know this grand game of China, Putin, Russia, United States, all of that. Just the music is different. The
Right.
tone is different. He no longer thinks that Putin is a friend.
Well, Putin
Could be
gave him the bird. I think that's basically what happened.
Right.
Trump went out of his way to say, let's bring this war to an end. Remember at the outset of the administration, when the first trip to Europe at the Munich conference, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was saying, of course, Ukraine's not going to ever become a NATO member. Then we've had comments from the administration saying, well, yes, a peace deal would recognize Russian territorial gains, right? Especially in Crimea, which Russia annexed a decade ago, and then probably also in the 4 provinces that Russia claims sovereignty over, yet has not completely conquered militarily. Trump was ready to give Putin a deal. Basically, Trump is ready to cement the status quo as part of a ceasefire arrangement leading to the end of hostilities. And what has Putin's response been? No peace initiative, and instead the nightly bombing and droning of the Ukrainian civilian population. And so Trump has been very clear in the past couple of weeks where he's talked about how Putin was tapping him along, about how he'd have all these nice conversations, and yet he'd get home at night and Melania would say, well, did you see what he did after he stopped talking to you? He killed babies. And I think that got to Trump. What Trump always needs to have face in any negotiation, right? And Putin has spurned him. At the same time, I think that Trump is so eager to achieve peace deals that he might be willing to give Putin another, what is it now, 11th chance, even though the only way to change Putin's calculus is by increasing pressure on his regime economically, militarily, and politically. And we have yet to really amp up the pressure.
Well, and the other thing Trump does seem weirdly aware of in the last few weeks, and I thought of this when I heard him answer a question about who his successor was going to be the other day, and he did talk about Vance, he talked about Rubio in a way he hadn't before, is that all Putin has to do is outlast Trump's term. Time is of the essence for Trump, but not for Putin. And that's something that Putin has long known, and he is playing a long game because he can. He's not going to be, he's not term limited. So there's that sense of urgency, I think, on Trump's part. I worry a little bit about the lack of, to Matt's excellent point about China, the lack of conversation about China, because India immediately picked up the phone and started talking to Brazil and China when they heard about the tariff on Russian oil, or the potential, these tariffs on Russian oil. So there is a lot of strategic stuff going on that we haven't heard much from the administration about. I'm sure there's stuff going on behind the scenes in that regard at the State Department. Thank God for Senator Tom Cotton, who's been on top of the China stuff from forever, and it continues to do excellent work in making sure that our interests are protected. But I wonder how much of this is just Trump feeling the fact that he's a second term. Time is really ticking away for him. We've got midterm elections coming up. He's obviously getting involved in the redistricting debate that's going on. So that urgency might lead to more pressure, but it could just as well lead to, as Matt suggests, him giving Putin another chance to come to the negotiating table, which Putin has no interest in doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question Trump's changed his tune. I think the problem remains that there is no negotiation to be had with Putin, and even although we have not hit him hard energy-wise in terms of sanctions, even if and when we do, it's still going to be very hard to bring that to bear as something that would actually get Putin to sit down and make a deal, because Putin's built the economy for the Russian economy for this war to endure the slings and arrows, and the disapprovals and all the tactics of adversaries, including economic sanctions. So Trump likes to say, "Look, this isn't my war. This is Biden's war," but it is Trump's peace plan. That's all his. That's his baby from the start. It was supposed to be one day, and we're well past that. And I think it's going to be an ongoing problem for him, and obviously for Europe. So yeah, I'm not I'm doubtful about any actual progress being made.
Two things about that. So Trump is a bully, and Zelensky came to the Oval Office and had that excruciating session in which junior bully J.D. Vance, as the Marx Brothers as Groucho Marx once said, "Hey, you little bully, why are you beating up on that big bully?" Or, "Hey, big bully, why are you beating up on that little bully?" There they were. They nailed him. They threw him out of Washington. He flew home. He didn't have dinner, all of that. And he was unshaken. The only instability in Ukraine in the last 3 years, politically, whatever, came with this trouble over the revision of an anti-corruption law. It's a domestic issue. There's no widespread protests about how the war is being conducted. There are no widespread protests, Israel style, about how let's just bring this to an end because our children are suffering. The Ukrainians do not want the war to end. Zelensky just put his head down and kept working with the Europeans and did not get into it, didn't scrap with Trump and Vance. And I expect that there is a part of Trump's brain or spirit or heart or whatever that gained renewed respect for Zelensky for not folding and cratering under his "you don't have the cards" line that was not predictable.
I have a different read on the situation. I think that Zelensky did respond to what happened in the Oval Office in February by aligning himself with the peace initiative, aligning himself with Trump's objective to achieve peace by agreeing to different ceasefires, by agreeing to a potential ceasefire in the air, which would favor Russia, by the way, because Russia maintains the conventional advantage on the ground. And that produced a welcome response on Trump's part.
Okay.
And so then they were able to shift to Putin and say, okay, well, Zelensky is ready. And I would also just say that there was some polling data that came out just this morning showing that Ukrainians are tired of the war, as you would imagine they would be, with this constant nightly bombing of their cities. What they want is some type of negotiated settlement. And it's in a way similar to the Israeli public. The Israeli public wants some type of ceasefire deal that would lead to the release of the hostages. In both cases, the enemy will not grant that. Right. And that's the strategic problem. You have to figure out how to bend the enemy to your will. And in both conflicts, we have been unable to do that at this point.
Okay, so I want to align myself with what you said here. I think Zelensky had an easy hand to play in relation to Trump because he understands Putin in a way that Trump doesn't, and he knew that there was almost anything that he could agree to that Trump was proposing, precisely because Putin would not agree and would see the fact that he was saying this as a possible sign of weakness, and therefore that he could march forward. And of course, the Ukrainians are tired of war and are abused and suffering, and it's terrible. It's a little different from the Israeli situation because uh, those in Israel who do want, a ceasefire and an end to hostilities with this weird question of then what happens to Hamas, that a lot of people who are in the sort of peace camp, yada, yada over, sort of like, we'll bring the hostages home and the war will be over. Well, what will that mean for the war to be over? Does that mean Hamas remains in power? Is that safe? What message does that send in future conflicts? All of that. And they don't answer the question, because what they want is the magical thinking that you can somehow say the war is over and the hostages will materialize in an Israeli hospital, and everything will, and the bodies of the murdered hostages will somehow manifest themselves, and no one has to deal with the consequences afterward. That is the problem with the Israeli psyche, or those who are on this side. I doubt that there is anybody in Ukraine who can maintain that kind of sentimental illusion after the last 3 years, which is why what they may be saying is, we just don't see a path forward. We have held off the destruction of our country, and if we end up with a solution that is guaranteed by the Americans, we will effectively have defeated Putin, even if we don't get everything back. That may not have been something that they would have said in the middle of 2022, but it is certainly the case that the heroic resistance of the last 3 years must be something that is a matter of great pride to individual Ukrainians, and that they will look at the fact that they were not swallowed up, as everybody sort of expected them to be swallowed up, as a rallying cry for their own nationalist or their own national long-term existence, with all of Europe behind them and with the United States effectively behind them. So in that sense, while you're right that Zelensky bent to Trump in some rhetorical fashion, what he did was say, I want to be a part, I'm a civilized person. We are a civilized nation. We want to end up on the side of the civilized nations of the world. We'll follow your lead if this is where you think we can go to find a civilized solution. I don't think it's going to work, but we will follow your lead, because we need you, and you are our friend, and you have been friendly to us even if you were mean to me in the Oval Office. So that is the difference. And of course, it's all a question of how Putin reads the situation. Does he read Trump saying, let's have a meeting, or them saying together, let's have a meeting, or something like that, as a capitulation? Or is he preparing himself to have the American hammer slammed down on his head?
This is why I think the sequence is important, and why I believe Trump should follow through tomorrow with his deadline. I think he should impose some costs on Putin tomorrow. Say, look, I gave you the 10 days. You haven't given us anything. So here's higher tariffs on you. And you know what? We're going to impose additional banking sanctions as well, and see what Putin does. If Putin says, okay, I still want to meet with you to talk, then I think it's net zero. That is, Trump had consequences, but then he's having the meeting, and we'll see what we're going to do. Putin might respond by saying, well, I'm not having the meeting. In which case, okay, that you see what Putin is up to. I think that from the strategic standpoint, the worst thing would be to Trump say, you know what, we're going to have this meeting in September, so I'm not going to do anything tomorrow, because right. that just keeps the status quo going. And look, the status quo is not an inevitable Ukrainian defeat, as you sometimes see portrayed in the media. It is just the inevitable slow march of Russia throughout these provinces that it is attempting to annex in the eastern part of Ukraine. And more Ukrainian deaths, more Russian deaths, and of course, more Ukrainian civilian deaths as well. And that's, of course, no one wants that.
So let's move on to discuss the tariffs. None of us. I'm gonna Acknowledge from the outset, none of us is an economist. None of us is a trade economist.
You sound like the very special episode of like a sitcom in the 80s. It's like, this is a very special episode where we warn you.
Where we're going to warn you about the tariffs. Just say no. Just say no to the tariffs.
Or today where they say, warning, someone may be smoking in the show that you're about to watch.
Have you noticed, by the way, that if you watch anything, anywhere, any show, anything, podcast, whatever, in which they mention a suicide, the show has to end with if you have suicidal thoughts, please call.
See, I don't mind that. I think that's harmless.
Okay.
It doesn't end with it. By the way, it starts with it. I watched something that says this episode portrays suicide.
That's right. If you have thoughts, if you have this, please contact the hotline.
Spoiler alert, if they put it at the front.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Anyway, I'm sorry. I just thought it was interesting because it is part of the tradition of the very special episode. So the tariffs go into effect, and we are the world's response to the tariffs is not what has not been all year what we thought that it was going to be, which is very interesting. And maybe 30 years ago it would have been this, and it's not now, which is that there's no panic. Stock markets aren't cratering by 10,000 points. There are no crazy sell-offs. Margin calls are not coming in. If you hold positions in companies that are likely to have grave consequences from the tariffs, like some Japanese automakers or something, you're not fleeing into bonds. There's no sign of a kind of international, the world is ending. There was a little bit back in March, but it resolved itself and stabilized. The Dow Jones is at like close to 44,000. Oil prices are not appreciably higher. I just looked there; it's $65 a barrel, which is not a panic number. If Trump tomorrow imposes, tariffs on Russian energy, which he has done, as we say, kind of like secondarily with this weird energy Russian tariff on India to some extent, we'll see what happens there. So the question that free traders and people who think that tariffs are really bad are going to have to deal with is, if it's a dog that doesn't bark, what's the argument against them? And there are many good arguments against them, and I'm not going to get into that. Our friend David Bahnsen has almost every economist that you've ever met will explain to you why this is bad, and history will explain to you why it's bad. But I don't think Trump is going to be feeling it, and then he can mask it or mask the effect of the tariffs in his brilliant PR way by having Tim Cook of Apple come to the White House and announce a $100 billion program to make the glass for his computers in Kentucky. Now, by the way, all of that glass is going to be made by robots. So the idea that building a plant, you have to employ workers. So that's one thing. So you're going to build a plant in Kentucky to make glass for computers, and you'll employ workers for the period of time in which it takes to build the glass or to clean the grounds or whatever. But it's not like this is a high employment move. It's not bringing jobs back to the United States. This is an entirely roboticized industry, and the manufacture of this high quality glass is not overseen by a lot of people. But it was a pretty good play yesterday.
But who's going to remember that when the price of lots and lots of things is in 3 or 6 months from now much higher? I don't think anyone will care about a factory that Apple is building. And I do think those prices will increase. You say there hasn't been panic yet, but we haven't actually lived with the effects of the tariffs yet either. And so that inflation has not gone down as much as many had hoped. If you increase prices, and then you've got all the Democrats running around saying he's cutting Medicaid, he's doing, the midterm elections will be in some sense a referendum on the price of things in this country. And I've seen more an uptick on social media and other places where people are comparing, even from a few years ago, grocery bills, things like that. So he does have to keep in mind what the consumer will end up paying, because he's telling Americans this is good for you. But if they don't feel that in their pocketbook, they will not believe that message.
I think we've seen some effects from imports becoming more expensive. Overall, I'm not sure we've seen the tariffs affect the inflation rate. A recent conversation with the CEO, he said that one reason inflation is still elevated is all goes back to the Biden spending binge. It takes just a long time to get all that money out of the system and return to normal, and that's why he expected inflation to fall in the coming year. They actually expect growth to increase in the coming year as well, ahead of 2026. I think the most striking thing about the tariff debate is the field reversal on taxes that is occurring in the two parties. This morning, I woke up to President Trump's Truth account, as I usually do. And he posted at midnight on August 7th. And you know he means it because it's all capital letters and 4 total exclamation points. It's midnight. Billions of dollars in tariffs are now flowing into the United States of America. And this has been a constant with the revenue that is being generated by the tariffs. And you have more Republicans coming around and saying, look at the $30 billion that's flowing into the Treasury every single month from the tariffs. However, we finally discovered a tax that Democrats don't like, and it's the tariff. It's usually Democrats are for any type of tax. They want more revenue to the government. That's the whole mechanism of liberalism. More revenue to the government that liberals can redistribute. Now, though, they don't like this revenue at all. And not only is it the Democrats who found a tax they don't like, the Wall Street Journal observes this morning, in its editorial pages, which remain conservative, that Jerome Powell doesn't like tariffs. In fact, he's holding interest rates because he's worried about, as Christine says, the inflationary effects of tariffs, the potential inflationary effects of tariffs. And yet he never voiced any opposition to the Democrats' tax plans throughout his 4 years. The desired increases in upper incomes, the proposals for a wealth tax that Kamala Harris was floating, the global corporate minimum tax that was a key part of the Biden Treasury agenda. So I would just like some consistency. I think we find some consistency here in my ivory tower at the American Enterprise Institute. We don't like any taxes, whether they fall on incomes or whether they fall on imports. But that clearly ends as soon as you step out onto the street of Massachusetts Avenue.
Republicans were free traders, and then now Trump introduced the tariff regime back, and now suddenly, yes, Democrats have found a new religion in the idea that it's weird though, because they should be opposed to China. They should be hostile to China. The global warming contingent in the Democratic Party, China's the largest pollutant on the planet Earth by sort of like square inch or growing or whatever. And so why is it left to us and to Tom Cotton and others to talk about China's trade practices and the evils of that? They should be screaming about it. They're the unionized. They're the party of unions. They're the party of the American unionized worker whose position in manufacturing cars and things like glass and all of that have been hampered by the 30-year opening to China and the low engagement with Chinese imports. The fact that
there are some Biden officials, former Biden officials, who are critical of the Trump administration's trade approach on China. And, going back to what we were talking about earlier, Trump has not been as hawkish on China in his second administration as you might think. They recently allowed, for example, China to purchase NVIDIA chips that the China hawks really opposed. But that was basically a part of a deal whereby we're allowing China to purchase these very high-end chips that NVIDIA creates. And China has said that they're going to let out more rare earth minerals, which they have a monopoly over, essentially. So you read people who are sympathetic to Biden, people who were supportive of Kamala Harris in the last election. They're become more hawkish on China. Where the real divide is over the global trade regime that Trump has kind of concocted out of his whims, and using various arguments, he has totally reshaped global trade. And if I'm in the administration, I have to be wondering what my game plan is if the courts rule that Trump has exceeded his power under the statutes governing presidential trade authority. Last week, we had the hearing at the Federal Court of Appeals, not far from the White House, where the court at that level is looking at a lower court's ruling that Trump's tariffs, many of them are unconstitutional, that they exceed his authority, the levels that he set in the global reciprocal tariff. And we'll probably get a ruling from that court in the next month. And that tees up the Supreme Court to visit Trump's trade authority in the coming term. And this is huge because, the Constitution grants the power to tax and the power to control trade to the Congress. And while the Congress has delegated quite a bit of trade authority to the president over the past 90 years, it doesn't seem like they granted this much. And so we may wake up one morning, and the Trump administration may wake up one morning to find that a lot of what Trump has done will have to be redone. And that will, I think, produce a whole other set of gyrations in the economy and in American politics, because Trump won't be happy if the Supreme Court says you have to roll these back.
Yes, but the American people should be, because just as we argued that the abuse of executive use of emergency, everything being declared an emergency is often an attempt to overreach one's authority and power. I think if the legislature is forced to actually clarify what an emergency power is, that would be good long term for how our system operates. Because there's been a ton of abuse by both sides on that. I also just want to add one other thing to the China question. We should at least acknowledge that the Democratic Party elite spends a lot of time on college campuses that are funded by Chinese government money. That the amount of money poured into lots of these institutions. There was this supposed scandal that went nowhere because there was not a smoking gun about the Penn Biden Center at University of Pennsylvania. But, Hunter Biden traveled with Joe Biden when Joe Biden was vice president, went to China to set up a Chinese hedge fund or something, to do business with China. So the Democratic Party elite has been perfectly comfortable being very cozy in taking a lot of money flowing back and forth between the United States and China, even as we knew that China is not an ally. So I think when you talk about the workers, the reason that the Democratic Party has abandoned them, and many of them then abandoned the Democratic Party in the last election, is that the elite in the Democratic Party stands to benefit financially. And as we see this on the college campuses with these centers, which are heavily funded by CCP money.
Hey, by the way, not just college people, who took 19 trips to China before he was nominated to be the vice presidential candidate of the Democratic Party in 2024. Coach
Everyone's
Walz.
favorite masculine man.
Coach Walz. And he wasn't no college professor. He was a high school guy because China was doing what the gutteries have been doing, and attempting to create influence inside the country by reaching down further than universities and engaging with high school teachers to bring them along to their views, even before he,
See, I
became
want
a
him to write a
politician.
memoir, not Kamala, and it can be called like Honeymoon in Beijing or something, and we get the whole inside story of his trips to China.
That's a great question, actually. Why hasn't he announced a book deal?
Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
there's no market for
who would
it.
want it? I
Who
know.
would want to look
Who
at
would,
it?
who would want it? Um, uh, by the way, so to move on from this, interesting stuff is going on in the Democratic Party. Primary in Washington State seems to indicate that the move to the right in Seattle after the total catastrophe of Seattle in the wake of COVID and Black Lives Matter, which led to the election of a bunch of local political figures who were more moderate than the people who had been running the city during its worst days. They're now up for reelection, and that the early indicators are that they are being displaced by more radical neo Mamdani types in Seattle, which brings up an interesting talking point for the right that I think the right is misunderstanding. We are seeing terrible numbers on Democratic approval in the United States, worse than 30 years, 40 years, deep disapproval of the Democratic Party. And people are saying, you see the Democrats, they move too far to the left and people don't like them and they hate them. And that is not where it appears those numbers are coming from. Those numbers are coming from disaffection with the Democratic Party, from the left, from the Democratic left, from the idea that the Democrats screwed the pooch, did wrong with Biden, holding on to Biden, and are kowtowing to Trump and somehow allowed Trump to get reelected, and that what they did was they didn't do enough. Everything that we look at in the Biden years and think, my God, this was an unprecedented growth of federal spending, an unprecedented growth of the use of federal powers to control things like the rental apartment market in the United States and businesses and all kinds of things, and all the efforts to forgive loans and all of that. That was nothing. That was what was that? It was nothing, and they got nothing, and it did nothing. And I think we are seeing an interesting political dynamic in the United States where the right thinks that the numbers for Democrats are a good sign for them, and they might be in law because the American people are coming to their senses. But I don't think that that's what these are about, and I think that they're more a sign that the Democratic Party is losing its mind and is going to shift hard to the left, or is in the middle of a hard to the left shift that is anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, supportive of extra legal means of discipline for being terrible on issues that you care about, like kind of liking Luigi Mangione for shooting the head of United Healthcare in the back. That stuff. And aside from whether or not it's politically good for Republicans in the short term, it's obviously terrifying for anybody who is worried about the American future in the long term, because there are only two parties really in the United States, and if one of them is going stark raving insane, supporting terrorism and opposing capitalism, I mean, we saw some of this in the late 60s, early 70s with the shift in the Democratic Party. Then, still, I think people are enjoying it too much and are not dealing with the possible horror that we are seeing here in these municipal elections, which function in a party, all of whose power is urban. Democrat Party is a party centered in 10 metropolitan centers.
But
so it functions almost like a midterm for liberal Democrats to be ousted by radical Democrats in 2009, in 2025, is a harbinger of a move in the party in general.
But are we certain that the complaint is that the party hasn't been left enough, or that it hasn't been effective enough, and that there's this sort of broad and people aren't sure how to get to an effective party, what that would mean or what that would
abundance
look like.
or anarchy, right?
Right.
Which is it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, right. Exactly. Yeah. At the two extremes.
Yeah, I think the test case I'm looking at is the Michigan Senate race and the primary in Michigan. It's an open seat. Mike Rogers, who barely lost in 2004, is going to be the Republican nominee. He has a clear path to the nomination, but it's a three-way race on the Democratic side, and it's very interesting. You have one of the candidates is the state senator, Mallory
McMorrow,
who went viral for some speech she gave, I think, on trans rights in the state legislature or state senate, and then made an appearance at the DNC last year. So, more cultural progressive. Then you have Representative Haley Stevens, who is a kind of, I would say, almost, she's to the right of Michigan's Senator Alyssa Slotkin, especially on questions of Israel. She's a supporter of Israel, but again, also a supporter of abortion rights and, of taxing the rich, whatever kind of litmus test on the gun control you want on the Democratic side. And then you have the third candidate, who is the Bernie Sanders candidate, whose name is Syed, I believe.
Yeah.
Let me see. He is a doctor, and yes, Abu al-Sayed. And he is right out of the Mamdani Omar Fatah, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, Hate America, Hate Israel, anti-Semitic mold. Michigan's an interesting test case. Obviously, huge Arab population in Michigan.
Relatively speaking. 400,000.
Right. It's the largest Arab population in the country is Michigan.
Right. Yeah.
And but it's still Michigan, and it's statewide. And so if you could see al-Sayed win that primary, then I think you're right, John. But I think it's still open. Right. And so it's, again, you look at these cities and they are like petri dishes for socialism and radicalism. And because they've essentially forced out the middle class over the past couple decades, there's no middle class in the cities. There's even working class is hard to find in the cities. It is a barbell coalition, wealthy liberals and then people who are working poor, right? You get all these distortions. And if I'm a Republican right now, what I'm thinking about, I know I've used this formula, if I'm the hypothetical, I don't know why I'm in this today, but in case, I'm more concerned about what's happening on independents than I am with the Democrats. Because what I've been looking at the polls is independents are rushing to support Democrats in the polls. And that will not be good for the midterm election for Republicans next year, unless Republicans can remind independents that the people that they're rushing to are insane.
But wait, can I just add, because I stepped on Abe's earlier point, which is a really important point about whether this is tactics or philosophy on the part of the Democrats. And I wonder if some of that is a confusion to them because of their geriatric leadership right now, which I remember Pelosi with the squad. Remember how she managed them? She was sort of like, well, they're getting positive attention for us. They're raising money. They're doing some crazy things, but I'll just let them play around in their sandbox. And the very, very aging leadership of the Democratic Party, particularly in the House and Senate side, and some of the, impetus for these younger candidates who are more radical to push them out. I think there's still a fair number of Democrats, the older ones, who think that they can manage these people in a way that has gotten away from them. And so those independents, I think Matt's absolutely right. That is an area where a moderate Republican, if they don't get gerrymandered out of their congressional district in the next few months, can say, well, you might not like everything Trump does, But that's what your future will look like if this is what you're going to vote. If you vote for that, we know what's coming, and that's socialism, that's a squad, that's anti-Semitism, all that stuff. But I do think Abe's point about whether it's tactics or philosophy, that's the battle they're having between the older generation and the younger.
Okay, so it's a dynamic process. The Republicans will benefit in 2026 with independence if the Democrats continue to go down this road, because there will be real world examples, and we can see this in how Mamdani is running here, of what it will be like if these people run for office. And the parallel is 2010 and the Tea Party and Tea Party Republicans, who primaried Republicans, primaried moderate Republicans, saying that they were weak, vacillating, were not opposing Obama enough, and basically did a pre-takeover of the party, scared those who survived them, and got them all basically in line by the election of 2010 or after they won the House in 2011. So I think the Democrats are. I don't agree with you that there are still people who think they can manage Mamdani. I think they're scared. I think they know this is coming for them. They know it better than we do. They have survivalist instincts honed over many decades of political action. They can feel the pulse and temperature of people on their streets and things like that, and in their regions, and they can trim their sails accordingly. My feeling, though, is that Republicans who look at what is going on and think that it functions as a kind of national endorsement of Trump, that the Democrats are so unpopular, are misunderstanding the meaning. I don't think that this is a shift toward. I think the shift toward Trump has already happened in the electorate in some ways, but they are misreading the national mood, which is not particularly favorable to Trump. Now, and also in 2010, just to finish this point, they had one issue that they could nail Obama on, as well as where they were going, which was Obamacare. There was this one giant thing that happened. And if Trump provides them with a giant thing, like massive confusion over the tariffs, either they do increase inflation or the Supreme Court rules that the tariffs are unconstitutional, which means, by the way, that they're going to have to be paid back. like they're going to.
That's the most complicated part.
And that is the most complicated.
That's insane.
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't know how that's going to work. If someone says, "Well, these are unconstitutional tariffs, and so you have to pay them back." This is why I actually don't think it's a slam dunk that the Supreme Court's going to overrule the tariffs. By the way, and I also on just quickly on the tariffs, Jed Rubenfeld of the Free Press, excellent legal columnist, he had a very good piece early on the constitutionality of the tariffs. And he said what the Trump administration should really be doing is arguing for their constitutionality under the Tariff Act of 1930, also known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. So if the Trump administration does go to the Supreme Court later this year and say, look, yeah, we've been arguing under these other set of statutes, but at the end of the day, we think that Smoot-Hawley gives Trump the power to do this. I think they'd have a strong case based on Jed's analysis, and it'd be ironic if Trump, who has resurrected Smoot-Hawley-like protectionism, is actually saved by it. But just a couple things on.
By the way, we should just mention for people who are sane and don't actually follow this that closely, Smoot-Hawley is among the most notorious pieces of legislation, in not only the history of the United States, but in the history of the world. It is largely given credit for causing the worst depression in the history of the planet.
So many people,
and many people are.
Milton Friedman had a different interpretation.
I know he did.
I'm with Uncle Milty always, but
they were. It wasn't good.
It wasn't a good thing. Not going to argue. I've been arguing, saying that they're taxes. I hate taxes all hour.
Yes.
Here's what's interesting about the Mamdani. The timing of the Tea Party. So you had all these primaries, and then they go right into the cycle, and then you had 2 years of the Tea Party Congress and the debt ceiling crisis and fights over Obamacare and such. And what happens? Obama wins re-election in 2012, and the Democrats maintain control of the Senate in the same year. Mamdani, if he wins in November of this year, will have 10 months of governing New York City next year, ahead of the midterm elections. And that will be a gold mine for Donald Trump and the Republican Party if Mamdani decides to govern New York City according to his beliefs. And so that could change the equation
That's
here.
what I meant by saying that it's a dynamic process.
Right.
What the candidates say and what Mamdani and maybe whatever the new mayor of Seattle or the new Seattle City
or the
Council
Michigan
does,
Senate candidate, right?
or the Michigan candidate says, but I mean, you are right that there will be political acts during 2026 that can become matters that the election will litigate in November. But it did help the Republicans, obviously, for Obama to pass the most controversial piece of legislation, again, in sort of modern American history. And history is contingent also because who knows what would have happened if John Roberts hadn't pulled his bizarre Talmudic, pseudo-Talmudic decision to support and oppose Obamacare at the same time and then leave it standing in his terrible decision of his terrible opinion of 2012. I mean, we don't know if Obamacare had been ruled unconstitutional, if Obama would have survived.
Or if Hurricane Sandy hadn't hit New York and New Jersey.
Yeah, so history is always contingent. The one thing to note, though, is that everything that Trump owns everything himself personally. That's the one aspect of his governance that is Obama was a little like this. And maybe Bush, so maybe everybody is. I don't know. Maybe I'm going in the wrong direction. But I mean, basically, if Trump is at 40% popularity on Election Day 2026, that will have gigantic national consequences. And it's relatively new for a midterm election to ride on a president's favorability. You know, there are 435 candidates or 900 candidates for House and Senate.
Yeah.
You know, and
it seems to be the most correlated factor is presidential job approval.
Right. That wasn't true. Again, that wasn't true in like when I was in my 20s and 30s. That wasn't true, and it's become more and more true as the president has taken on the powers of Congress. So that the idea that anyway, it's a very. I only began this by wanting to caution the triumphalist people on the right who love seeing the Democrats have bad numbers, that people who are worse than you can even imagine might be coming down the pike as a result of those bad numbers, and they can win elections, and they can drag this, the consequences for the country in 2028 could be incredibly disastrous. So there's some crushing morosity for you. We'll leave it there. For Matt, Abe, and Christine, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.